Hi, I'm Fareed Zakaria. Education has never been more important to America's future. Supporting children's early development is the most important long-term investment we can make. And the best way to do that is to work with their parents. It is the educational levels of the parents, their ability to read and write and speak English, that has the most profound impact on their children's academic performance. Literacy Partners offers low-income and immigrant parents in New York City intensive free classes to help them build the skills they need to achieve success in today's world. It promotes a child's early development and school readiness. This is job training for the most important job there is, the job of parenting. It is a solution that works. According to the Best Plus test developed by the Center for Applied Linguistics, nearly 80% of the adult students gain at least one academic level and achieve their goals during the year. According to the surveys and reading logs that students themselves keep, parents increase the time they spend reading with children. That's the single best way to promote a child's early language development, and it rises by 40%.
When he sees me read at night, then he will take up his book and he will read also.
Not only that, according to the Head Start developmental assessments, the children of Literacy Partners students showed a minimum of 67% more progress on their early academic assessments than their peers in the same preschool. I've seen many efforts to break cycles of poverty, and I am impressed by the results this small organization achieves. I hope you'll join me in supporting Literacy Partners by visiting its website, www.literacypartners.org. Thank you and enjoy the flight.
Since I was 5 years old, singing was my first ambition. It took me a while to learn songs because I had to learn by listening. That was hard, but that's life. I did it my way. I could work with my hands. I could sing, I could fix things, but when you put that book in front of me, the whole pages go blank. And that's the way it was with me, with anything that had to do with reading or writing. I just started to sweat.
When he was in elementary school, He must have just fallen through the cracks. His teachers didn't pay attention to him. He somehow never gave up. He managed to get through school, get through life, and never quit. And he decided to go back to school to learn to read and write.
One of his goals and one of his desires was to write an autobiography.
I was going to put in the good and the bad and the things that happened to me as a child in school and couldn't read and write.
And then COVID-19 happened, and we couldn't be together at Literacy Partners offices. And he was in Corona, and I was in the Upper East Side, and we were determined to finish up this biography.
Hello?
All right, are you all set up?
Yes.
Okay. We just started over the phone.
And we managed to finish the biography and get it published last December.
To think I did all that, and may I say, not in a shy way, oh no, not me, I did it my way. For what is a man? What has he got? If not himself, then he has not to say the things he truly feels, and not the words of one who kneels. The records show I took the blows and did it my way. Thank you.
I dropped out of school just before my 12th birthday.
When my daughters were young, they used to ask me to help them with their homework, but I really couldn't do it because I didn't know how to read and write myself.
Without education, the streets was the only thing to escape to.
A young man got up and he said, I can't read, and I have a wonderful job, and I make my wife read to me at night all of my papers and things. And I thought, holy cow, we could teach this guy to read.
The origins of Literacy Partners are in the emancipation movement. Adult literacy tutoring in the United States really has its origin in the freedom schools, when teaching somebody to read and write was such a threat to the social order of the time that you could be arrested for it. It was a crime to teach African Americans to read and write in this country not so long ago. So out of that history, we started in the early 70s on the ethic of each one, teach one. If you knew how to read and write, it was your obligation to help your fellow New Yorker.
And of course, the stars of Literacy Partners became these graduates who would reduce audiences, ballrooms, to tears.
It opened up the whole world for me.
The day I got my GED was the happiest day of my life.
Immediate action required. Leave color en route area for a maximum of 30 minutes. Dining room, kitchen, microwave. Keep out of reach of children. Take 2 tablets orally every 5 hours as needed. Do not exceed 6 tablets daily. Thank you.
When parents can't read, children can't just be children. Literacy Partners is taking action, teaching parents to read. Parents like me.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Jamie Harris, and I'm past president for Maryland TESOL, an affiliate of International TESOL. And International TESOL, a leading association of English language learners globally, are happy to partner with Literacy Partners on this event. This event is hosted by Literacy Partners and kicks off the organization's celebration of Black History Month and Toni Morrison. Literacy Partners is an adult literacy program. African American and immigrant parents come to our program to transform their lives and create a brighter future for their family through the power of literacy. Access to stories and the ability to tell one's own stories is essential to heal from trauma, individual and collective. Adult literacy has always been a tool for liberation and a means of organizing to end systemic oppression. Tonight's panel will focus on the importance and challenges of teaching Toni Morrison, especially given the current national context. I get the pleasure of introducing our panelists and also our moderator. First, we have Dr. Carolyn Denard, who is founder and board chair of the Toni Morrison Society. As board chair of the Society, Dr. Denard has helped to launch many of the signature initiatives of the Society. She was recently Associate Provost and Professor of English at Georgia College and State University. She has served as a professor at Georgia State University, as an Associate Dean of the College at Brown University and Emory University, and as Dean of the College at Connecticut College. Dr. Denard's research interests include Toni Morrison's use of Black cultural aesthetic in her work. Dr. Denard has written numerous articles on Morrison's life and works and has edited 2 books. She, Dr. Denard, is currently completing a book manuscript exploring the ways in which African myths inform Morrison's construction of heroism in her fiction. Dr. Denard has received her BA in English from Jackson State, her MAT from Indiana University, and her PhD in American Studies from Emory University. I'd also like to introduce Honorée Fannone Jeffers. She's a poet, essayist, and a novelist. She's the author of 5 critically acclaimed books of poetry. Her first novel and 6th book, The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois, was listed as one of the 10 best books of 2021 by the Washington Post and New York Times Review, and won the National Books Critic Circle Award. Love Songs has received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, and Booklist, positive mentions in Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Essence, the New York Times, Observer, and was named Anticipated Book by Miss N, Goodreads, and Bookpage, has called Honorée a writer to watch. Honorée has won various fellowships and was elected to the American Antiquarian Society. She has won the 2018 Harper Lee Award for Literary Distinction, and in 2020, she was induced into the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame. Honorée is a professor of English at University of Oklahoma in Norman, where she has taught since 2002, excuse me. And our moderator for this evening is Mary Romney. Mary Romney Schaub is a retired educator with over 40 years of experience teaching English as a foreign or second language in Spain and the US. She has an EDM in instructional media, an MA in the teaching of English to speakers of other languages, both from Columbia University, and an MA and a BA both in Spanish from Middlebury College. She has been a member of the TESOL International Association since 1986 and has held several leadership positions in the association. She's interested in languages, African diaspora culture, history, and oral history. Her most recent nonfiction book is Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era. Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I certainly appreciate that introduction. You know, I feel that Toni Morrison is really literary royalty, so it's a great honor to be part of a panel with such distinguished scholars who are authorities on her work. So with that, we'll embark on our first question, which has two parts. Why do you think Toni Morrison has been a particular target of book bans? And in connection with that, what do you think Toni Morrison would say about the recent efforts to ban books and suppress interrogation of history?
I'd like Dr. Denard to start because I am not a scholar of Toni Morrison. I'm a student of Toni Morrison and a lifetime member of the Toni Morrison Society. But I'm a scholar of Phyllis Wheatley Peters. So Dr. Denard is the expert here, and I'd love to defer to her.
Well, thank you, Honorée, and thank you, Mary, for your introduction, and Literacy Partners for this very exciting program. It's a great way to celebrate Black History Month and certainly to get started with the celebration of Toni Morrison that you will, of Song of Solomon that you will be doing later in this month. For the first question, why do I think Morrison's been the particular target of book bans is because Morrison is famous and she is a gifted artist, and she's talented and really popular among high school teachers. The Toni Morrison Society did a series of teacher workshops called Language Matters, and the response from high school teachers was just phenomenal because they want to teach Morrison and they want the background for that, but they don't always, most teachers don't have that. So, and so often they will choose Morrison as the critical text they want to introduce their students to because they love this work. And so it becomes then, because the students are reading Morrison is hard. The teachers don't always have the time to do the kind of background work that you need to do to prepare students for that. And so it becomes an easy target for people who are already leery of what's being taught in the schools. And I think that because Morrison is difficult, there just really needs to be more background information. And I talk a little bit more about this when we talk about what teachers can do. One of those things certainly is to be more proactive with the parents and with the students and with the school boards for that matter. But I do think it's a matter of Morrison's popularity, Morrison's skill as an artist, her celebratory statue in the world. I mean, she's one of the most gifted writers in the world and respected the world over. So teachers want to teach Morrison. And if parents or those groups that want to attack something going on in school, Morrison becomes a vehicle for them to do that with a lot of publicity. Now, regarding what she would say, I think actually Morrison would not be surprised by the banning of books. She actually took some pleasure in encouraging that kind of deliberate reading and understanding of her books. Mm-hmm. And if they offended, if they brought something to the forefront that people didn't know, then she thought essentially that was a good thing. She had her own experience with banned books. She said at first she hated Huckleberry Finn. When she read it, and the excessive use of the N-word and how Jim was treated by the young boys. But she said on second reading, I'm really getting into that novel. She really began to see why it was considered one of the best of American novels, and actually wrote an introduction to one of the editions of Huckleberry Finn. So I think that Morrison would not be surprised by this. She's sort of famous for saying that what people think that's going on with the reading of these texts is often not what is going on. You know, students are reading and getting something sometimes entirely different from what their parents or the detractors or the people who want the book banned are holding up for ridicule. That is not what the students are experiencing. But I do think that she would encourage, as we are encouraging, as I am encouraging, that we do need to do more of the background work in preparing students for these novels. There's a lot in a Morrison novel, and the targets that are always there, sex, race, some critique of American society that people don't want, those are the things that are in her books, not because those are necessarily the subjects, but because that's part of the whole composition of what she's trying, of the story she's trying to tell. So I don't think she would be surprised. I think she would really say, you know, we've got some work to do.
Thank you.
Dr. Denard is a scholar here, a Morrison scholar here, and so I'm just gonna, you know, take it back to the front porch. I think that one of the reasons that people are white people are conservative white people are so determined to ban Toni Morrison is not simply because of her work, but also her person. When you go on social media and you sort of go to these pages of Black women, there are these videos that are constantly shared where Toni Morrison is very strong and very confident and has a moral clarity about Blackness and womanhood and what we also would add femmehood, right, in this particular time. And that is terrifying for people, because Black women are not supposed to consider themselves brilliant. Black women are not supposed to have the confidence to say to someone, no, I don't want to answer those questions, or those questions are offensive to me, and so on and so forth. So I think it's not simply her brilliance, which is, you know, obvious. It's also her moral stance that continues to resonate even after she joined the ancestral plane. That is terrifying. And it is because it is a direct challenge to the worldview of white supremacy. So I think that those two things, what Dr. Denard has very brilliantly talked about, and then the fact that, you know, people just don't want to see, you know, a Black woman feel, you know, feel confident and not, you know, tucking her head in, you know, under and nobody, you know, they don't want, white supremacists do not want to transfer that kind of worldview to Black children. You know, they want the reset button. You know, they want to hit the reset button every generation so that our children, and I say our, even though I'm a child-free woman, our children do not feel good about themselves, cannot have that sort of intellectual confidence. And so then that is going to, if they don't have that, that is going to spread to how our community thrives instead of survives. That's what I think.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Now, What is a passage or a sentence from Morrison's work that continues to amaze you each time you read it? And how has its meaning changed over time?
Whew, so many.
You want me to start again, Honorée?
Dr. Denard, do your thing.
Okay, all right. I'm going to read a sentence that never ceases to amaze me. I actually have 2 or 3 of those, but since we're focusing on Song of Solomon this month, I will read one from Song of Solomon. And this is a sentence that comes early in the novel when Morrison is creating that memorable afternoon when Mr. Smith jumps off the roof of Mercy Hospital. And one of the streets that the people are walking down during that time is a street called Not Doctor Street. And it's a street name that the post office doesn't recognize. And Morrison's description of how the street got its name never ceases to amaze me because of its humor, of its embedded resistance, of its demonstration of Black community values, and a community ethic that they were not willing to submerge. And it is just, for me, so classic Morrison. I mean, one of the greatest things that I've learned about reading Morrison is her love for the Black community, the love for the things that we sometimes take for granted, how our mothers answer questions, how Black women can talk without opening their mouths. It's just, when I leave a Morrison novel, I am looking at my community altogether differently, and I am appreciating so much more. But this is a sentence about how Not Doctor Street got its name. It said, Not Doctor Street, a name the post office did not recognize, was named a post office did not recognize. So she says, town maps registered the street as Mains Avenue, but the only colored doctor in the city had lived and died on that street. And when he moved there in 1896, his patients took to calling the street, which none of them lived in or near, Doctor Street. Later, when other Negroes moved there and when the Postal Service became a popular means for transferring messages among them, envelopes from Louisiana, Virginia, Alabama, and Georgia began to arrive, addressed to people at house numbers on Doctor Street. The post office workers returned these envelopes and passed them on to the dead letter office. Then in 1918, when colored men began being drafted, a few gave their addresses at the recruitment office as Doctor Street. In that way, the name acquired a kind of quasi-official status, but not for long. Some of the city legislators whose concern for appropriate names and the maintenance of the city's landmarks were the principal part of their political life saw to it that Doctor Street was never used in any official capacity. And since they knew that only Southside residents, that is Black community, Southside residents kept it up, they had notices posted in all the stores, barbershops, and restaurants in that part of the city saying that the avenue running northerly and southerly from Shore Road, fronting the lake to the junction of Route 6 and 2, leading to Pennsylvania, and also running parallel to and between Rutherford Avenue and Broadway Avenue, had always been and would always be known as Mains Avenue and not Doctor Street. It was a genuinely clarifying notice because it gave Southside residents a way to keep their memories alive and please the city legislators as well. They called it not Doctor Street and were inclined to call the charity hospital at the northern end of town No Mercy Hospital. This passage, as I said, it's not, the kind of lyrical, beautiful language that we are so often we praise in Morrison, but it is that the wit and the deep knowledge and the care with which she demonstrates that or writes that, and then demonstrates the love and the community ethic that we will, and the resistance, that we will call this for the only black doctor in this town if we have to call it not Dr. Street. So they read the notice as calling it either one or the other, Mains and or both, Mains and not Dr. Street. So that's one of the passages that I really come back to and I read to my students, and they are just amazed and that's the value of reading Morrison out loud too, because when they read it silently, they don't always get it, but they do. And then I just have one other passage that I just think is so wonderful. This is from Jazz. Jazz is a novel, of course, that's written based on the structure of jazz. It is deeply musical, deeply rhythmic. And there is a passage that I also read aloud to my students, and I hope the teachers are picking up on the value of reading out loud to your students. This is a rhythmic description of the historical moment that they're in Harlem in the 1920s. And so rhythmic, this passage, I had a jazz musician to put this rhythm to write it out so that it could be played. And when we did the jazz performance at the American Church in Paris, this script was on the program. So I just want to read this to you. And this is when Morrison is describing Harlem in the 1920s. Here comes the new. Look out, there goes the sad stuff, the bad stuff, the things nobody could help stuff, the way everybody was then and there. Forget that. History is over, you all, and everything ahead at last. And so that rhythm, that riff, the things nobody could help stuff, the bad stuff, it is just beautiful. And my students, they said, I didn't even hear it until you read it out loud. So I think this is a demonstration of how Morrison can put music to language and incorporate again, as she did in Song of Solomon, what is valuable in African-American life.
So my passage is going to be from Playing in the Dark. So a lot of people are really shocked by the fact that I did not like the fiction of Toni Morrison until deep into my 40s. And so what led me back into her fiction was Playing in the Dark, which is almost like scripture to me. So this is a passage where she's talking about the Black presence in American literature. The contemplation of this Black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of the literary imagination. These speculations have led me to wonder whether the major and champion characteristics of our national literature, individualism, masculinity, social engagement versus historical isolation, acute and ambiguous moral problematics, the thematics of innocence, coupled with the obsession with figurations of death and hell, are not in fact responses to a dark, abiding, signing Africanist presence. It has occurred to me that the very manner by which American literature distinguishes itself as a coherent entity exists because of this unsettled and unsettling population. Just as the formation of the nation necessitated coded language and purposeful restriction to deal with the racial disingenuousness and moral frailty at its heart, so too did the literature, whose founding characteristics extend into the 20th century, reproduce the necessity for codes and restriction. And so one of the things that as we're talking about banning, and we're talking about her moral clarity, one of the things that Professor Morrison did was she took these things that were, you know, she took history or she took cultural phenomena, and then she would boil them down and bring them back to us in a way that many Black people or people of color, we were aware of it. But then when she told it to us, all of a sudden it was like a clap of thunder. Ah, okay. And I think that's one of the reasons people are trying to ban her, because her nonfiction is talking about this in a very straightforward way. And then her fiction illustrates its characterization, its plot, its crafting, what she's, this is why, you know, I just worship her. But it took me a while to really accept, you know, but because when I was reading her work, you know, the more difficult, you know, Beloved, for example, I was just like, this is a mess. I can't understand this. Then I read Playing in the Dark, and I said, there has got to be some kind of genius in this woman, because she is speaking to me so clearly. And then I went back to Beloved, and it just opened everything for me. And the one, you know, it's too long, but the one line that I read Beloved every other year or something like that. I've read Beloved at least 7 times. I've joked, but it's not a joke, that I will never be with a man again who has not read Beloved. Because to know Beloved is to know me, right? But at the end of Beloved, when Paul D is contemplating, Dr. Denard knows where I'm going. When Paul D is contemplating what Sixo says about the 30-mile woman, so it's layer, layer, layer. And he's thinking about Setha, and he says, she gather me, man. Whoo, it's just it's just wonderful.
Puts all the pieces in all the right places.
Puts all the pieces in all the right places. It's good when a woman is a friend of your mind, you know. and it's so Black, though, because I hear my uncles in that. I hear the boys I grew up with, you know, in Atlanta, in Eatonton, in this sort of folklore that she both creates, but builds upon the foundation of the existing folklore. It's astounding.
Mm-hmm. And I think it says something very significant about the dual role that she served. I mean, she was both a philosopher, if you will, a literary critic, and an artist. And I'm sure you, as a poet and a novelist, you know,
and a critic,
you know that is not an easy, you know, those are not easy places to move in and out of.
They are for me. And I think the reason that they are is, now that I'm in my 50s, I understand this. Everything that I write is contributing to a vision. Now, when I was in my 30s, and I just thought, well, I'm interested in this, I'm interested in that, blah, 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 blah. But now when I look back on it, everything, all my nonfiction, all my poetry, you know, I had short stories published before, you know, my big fat chubby novel, and all of that contributes to folklore. You know, my people are from Eatonton. My mother taught Alice Walker, so all of that sort of contributes to that. But I think the hard part is trying to figure out which genre it is. You know? Yeah.
And I think that for critics that I've talked to who have stepped out of that role and written fiction, they say they have to pull themselves back from explaining too much in the fiction. And so that was what I was thinking about, that sometimes you just kind of fall into the interpretive role more. But that's wonderful, and you've been able to do that, and I'm sure that the time has helped you do that too. And certainly that was the case with Morrison.
And the critics. I mean, one of the things is that I am very, very overt when I talk about the fact that the scholarship of people like you, Dana Williams, other folks, Jennifer L. Morgan, everything she writes is my jam, right? But the scholars help me with my work. I am someone who is very, very much based upon scholarship and criticism. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there was a really long time where Black writers were creative writers, they were scholars, they taught, there was all of that. It's only now that you get people where they're like, this is the genre that you're supposed to write in. This is the genre that you're supposed to write in. But when, I grew up, back when dinosaurs walked the earth, everybody was doing everything. My dad was a poet. He was also, he also wrote essays, different things like that. And so I just, he's one of the founders of, what's that? Design at Howard University. He was at Howard with Professor Morrison. And so, I'm used to that. And so I don't, my mentor, Lucille Clifton, and I repeat this all the time, would say, always be open to the word. And so however the word speaks, you follow. But sometimes it takes a while. For me, it wasn't so much too much description in my fiction. It was, where's the plot? I'm just, doing the words and feeling the vibe and, and then you've got to get there. But Miss Mary, I guess we should get back to Morrison.
I'm enjoying this so much. I forgot that I have to ask another question. This one is about teaching. So in what ways has teaching Morrison deepened or challenged your understanding of the text from when you first engaged with her work? And can you share an example of a time that a conversation with a student shifted your understanding or changed the way you taught a certain text by Morrison?
I teach creative writing. So now I did design the first early African-American literature class in my department, but I no longer, because I have an endowed chair now, I have a 1-1 load. So I only, teach creative writing. But we did read last semester in my advanced fiction class, we read recitative. And so I think the way that she plays with, I don't like to use race as a shorthand, right? I will say racial characterization or racial identification. I found that very brilliant, and the way that she would, and so I'm talking about teaching creative writers. What I will say is that the one time I tried to teach her in a literature class, things went left. Because I was giving a background. I was teaching Beloved as an example of magical realism, And one of my students, this was a very painful experience for me. One of my white students began, so I was talking about Margaret Garner, and so I told them the history of what it was based on. And then I showed them, how Morrison just did this brilliant, blossoming. And so the Margaret Garner, as Dr. Denard knows, the Margaret Garner history is that, she was forced, intimately assaulted by her master, and she was afraid that her girl child would experience the same. And so then I had a student who said, well, many black enslaved Black mothers wanted their daughters to become sex workers, and I didn't even know how to deal with that. It was so disturbing and disgusting. And she insisted that her African American literature, the studies teacher, had told her that. I didn't believe that, because this was a Black woman. And so I started talking to her, and I said, do you really know what it is that you're saying? And so it went back and forth, it kind of went back and forth. And then I just said, okay, well, this is very uncomfortable for me as the teacher, so I'm going to stop this. And when I came back that next class period, I did something that I very rarely do. I talked about personally what it felt like to be a Black woman hearing that, and how hurtful spiritually, to my core that had been. And then I said, of course, now this is not anything I can say now, right? Given, the national whatever. But I said, I'm taking a chance to be vulnerable with you here, because for me, I have to lead with love in the classroom. And many times leading with love means that you must make yourself vulnerable, even when I want to be this authority figure. And then I went on to talk about how Morrison had allowed me to do that. It was deeply distressing, deeply painful. And I think that's one also, again, when we talk about banning, these conversations are going to have to come up. You cannot teach anything by Morrison without having these kind of conversations, and they're going to be uncomfortable conversations. But any learning experience is uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. If it wasn't, we'd already have the degree, and we'd already know everything that we needed to know, and so on and so forth. So that, I didn't mean to harsh the vibe, but but that, that was an experience, Teaching beloved.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you, Honorée. I would say that what has deepened with me when I've taught Morrison is how clear I've gotten about the ethical code in Black life. And if you're not paying attention, or if you're paying attention to what others are saying about our community and what we value and what we don't value, then you can believe the hype, you can believe the negative hype. And one of the things that's happened in Beloved, when I'm teaching Beloved, and it just actually happened to me outside of the classroom, trying to prepare for class and get ready for that. And you realize that the community, Margaret Garner, Setha in the novel, does what she has to do. She has her own ethical, moral code. My daughter will not live like this. Mm-hmm. But what was always interesting to me, and humbling in some ways, was that the community said to Setha, that is not enough. I understand your pain, but this is not enough. this was not the choice that you should have made. And so with the community exacting its own moral code with Setha was really just kind of an eye-opening thing for me. That and Morrison is both the prosecutor and the defense in that novel, which is just brilliant. That we understand Setha's feeling in that shed, but her community says it's not enough. And by the same token, when Beloved comes back and she says, we understand, that you're trying to come back and get some revenge or understand, but this was an invasion. She had stayed too long. And those 30 women who come to that house and pray for Setha are the same women who had an opinion about what she had done earlier. So the strong moral ethical code in Black life that nothing takes away. There's no excuse for doing the wrong thing if your community believes it's the wrong thing. I've already talked about how I see everything wanting to know the story behind it. I remember when my students introduce themselves, they will tell me where they're from and, their hometown. I insist. And I've had students to say, I'm from Johnny Holler, Tennessee. And I almost have to stop the roll call right there because I want to hear all about this hollow in Tennessee that's named for some man named Johnny, and what is the rest of the story? Or even here in Georgia, Ball Ground, Georgia, or Money, Mississippi, and we know the stories behind some of those. But I think that the ethical code, the stories behind, the hidden in plain view kind of stories that Morrison shares with us, that's all a part of what deepens my understanding and appreciation and love for Black life and culture. Now, the challenge that I've had with teaching Morrison is, and what seems to have changed over time, is the role of women in Morrison's text. And it seems to me, you do have what I call those tar women, what Morrison called the women who keep the family together. It's the Mrs. McTeers, the Eva Pieces, the Pilots. Those are the women, Undine and Tar Baby, the women who help see heal in home. I mean, the women. They're the women who bring the macaroni and cheese and the green beans and the pound cake and
the fried chicken. Don't forget that.
Those are women who hold it together. But Morrison also has another kind of woman in her text, and I think that was, to some degree, I think that's what she was trying to say in Sula. And you have to decide which of these roles is the best role, or should we choose at all? But there's a passage that I would read to my students, and over the years, the classes have changed, and the women students have really begun to push back on this passage. I used to just feel this was the best passage I could possibly read to Black women students, and so they hear that, and then they push back and they say, well, isn't that stereotypical? And this is the passage. This is when Undine is talking to Jadine, her niece, and Jadine doesn't want to stay with them. She wants to go back to Paris. And she feels that they're kind of holding on to her for all the wrong reasons. So Undine, over the kitchen table where all the truth that needs to be spoken is spoken, she says to her, Jadine, a girl has got to be a daughter first. She have to learn that. And if she never learns how to be a daughter, she can't never learn how to be a woman. I mean, a real woman. And that's the line that gets the students. A woman good enough for a child, good enough for a man, good enough even for the respect of other women. Now, you didn't have a mother long enough to learn much about it, and I thought I was doing right by sending you to all them schools, and so I never told you it, and I should have. You don't need your own natural mother to be a daughter. all you need is to feel a certain way, a certain careful way about people older than you. And I think, now this is in Tar Baby, which is her fourth novel. It's 1981. And, we go all the way up to God Bless the Child, and you have a different kind of mother-daughter relationship in that text. And so I often wonder, if we got into that 12th novel or the 13th or the 14th, and Morrison once again revisited this mother-daughter, older woman, younger woman relationship, where would that have gone? How would she even have been impacted by that? And so this discussion of what is archetype, what is stereotype, students have pushed back. And, for me, it's archetype, for them it's stereotype. And, we just have a good discussion about that. But they are changing me. They are helping me to reread and to look at these things again. And what I'm finding is that most often Morrison has both of these kinds of women in her text. And I guess because of my own bias, I was assuming that she was favoring one kind over the other. But the language is clear. And this is, to me, the sad thing about, as Honorée has said, about banning books. When we get caught up in one scene that somehow offends and people don't understand and they haven't been prepared for it, and they want to just wipe out the whole novel. Song of Solomon has been banned in some school districts, not just Beloved, not just The Bluest Eye. They don't like the ways in which there's the sex scenes with Guitar and Hagar, or the language that the men use, the use of the N-word, all of these things that talk truthfully about the ways in which members of the community speak in cultural context. And so Song of Solomon has been banned too. But I think there's so much to miss if we don't, if we ban these books whole. And that's why I think preparation is so important. And for teachers to really decide what is the metaphor, and I think you alluded to this, Honorée, what is the metaphor? What is the message that you want your students to take away from this book? And then shape your lesson that way. It's not just a newsreel, not just read every page and, page 1 through 20 by Tuesday, and let's talk about that. It really, teaching a novel is hard, and you have to give the time, the prep, the breakdown, all of those things. So, but back to the question, I'm doing the same thing. I think what has deepened my appreciation for Morrison is certainly understanding that no amount of inhumane treatment turned Blacks into people who were inhumane. They maintained their own moral, ethical code in the face of those things. And then I think what's challenging me, and probably still challenging me, is this role, the changing role of women in Morrison's novels and in the culture.
Thank you to both of you. So the next question is about Song of Solomon. Later this month, Literacy Partners will be airing a marathon reading of Song of Solomon. What do you think your students have to learn from reading Song of Solomon or similar titles?
Well, I think one of the things that, as someone who is myself very deeply invested in African-American folklore and building upon folklore, it's always funny to me whenever sometimes I read reviews of my novel and someone will say, I just don't understand Joe. And I'm like, Joe is a folkloric figure, right? But they don't get that, right? But so folklore is very, very important to me. It's very, very important to a lot of writers, particularly Black Southern writers. And even though Morrison is from Ohio, I still view her as a Southern writer because, as we called, the North and the Midwest, we called it Up South. And so I feel like Song of Solomon, that novel is based upon the flying African folktale. And so I believe, Dr. Denard.
Yes.
Okay. Checking the calendar here. And so I think one of the things that I'm interested in is what is it that she's trying to give her writers from this folktale? Why is she using this? Not simply as a trope, not simply as mythos, but one of the things, and I'm not putting this on every Black writer, right? I resist that every Black writer must be political or must be giving something back to the community. But that said, right, Morrison's work was always giving something back to Black communities, a way of opening up the viewing Black communities. And so I think for Song of Solomon, what would that be? Why would she use that folktale? That to me would be one of the biggest things if I were going to teach it. But I have to also say this, and this is very unpopular, but I'm just going to keep it real. I would never try to teach Morrison to college students. Maybe grad students, but it's just so rich and so complicated. The only two novels that I could see teaching would be The Bluest Eye and would be Sula and maybe Tar Baby. But Beloved is just, trying to figure out the craft of what Morrison is doing in her later novels. A Mercy is a good one to teach as well. But her craft is so complicated. I don't think anybody, as a creative writing teacher, I'll teach particular novels or particular stories so that my students can learn, can emulate. There's no emulating Morrison. She's in a class by herself. Mm-hmm. And so I think, teaching Song of Solomon for enjoyment, yes, but it's so difficult. There's a whole backstory that you'd have to begin with. But of course, I'm not supposed to say that. I'm supposed to be talking about how we can teach it. No. But it is, I think graduate students can grasp it. Mm-hmm. But I think that, as Dr. Denard has very brilliantly pointed out, there has to be, you've got to start with a lesson plan. You've got to start with all your themes. It's not like some of these books where you can just read and y'all can just riff on it in the classroom. You can't do that teaching Morrison.
Well, I like to say I'm just delighted that they are reading this novel out loud. Morrison has such a fine use of the language, and Song of Solomon is such a musical book. There's songs there, and it's also filled, as Honorée says, with the folk tales, with the myths. It's just so rich. And one of the things I think that can happen, Honorée, when you're reading it in this marathon is there's not this time to stop and try to, do the teaching part of that. Mm-hmm. So they do get to experience it as a performance.
Yes.
And I just think that's wonderful, because there's so many places where you can really perform Song of Solomon. I mean, the music is just over and over again. When I think about those children, the children's game, that song, the song this Pilate sings at the beginning, it's just so rich and sonorous. I think that the students can, those who are listening to that marathon can just sit back and enjoy the language, enjoy the musicality of Song of Solomon.
And that's what she wanted.
That's what she wanted, right?
And about that. She talked about people never asked her about the language.
Yes,
they only asked
that's the thing that she cares the most about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they can also, if they stay to the end, they can experience the triumph of Song of Solomon. You know, she said in some interviews that some people think that, oh my God, did he commit suicide at the end? And and of course if you do a still frame, he doesn't hit the ground. We don't know whether he flies back to Africa.
The ground, but that's the whole myth.
Yeah, that's it.
No,
I just think there's such an opportunity for the listeners of that reading to experience the triumph of Song of Solomon, really to be inspired to say, what's my story? You know, who is my Shalimar? You know, to go back to that. So I think that's really the wonderful thing. They will understand, well, not understand, but hear and enjoy the music of the novel, appreciate the folk tales and the storytelling, and perhaps they will be inspired to look into their own ancestry. And I think that will be a great benefit of hearing the novel read.
And then they can return to it. And I think that's what I really, when I talk about, it's difficult to teach it, but I don't think that people should ignore novels simply because they're difficult. It took me 9 false starts for Beloved to finally power through. And one of the things that I did when I finally finished it, is that I was already a poet. I had I think 2 books. I just looked at it as a prose poem. And I just rolled with it. And once I did that, then it just opened it up.
And it is a prose poem.
Right. Sometimes you can't get everything, and that's why you go back and you reread it. So that's what I did when I finally got to the end, and I said, okay. And then I went back, as a creative writer, and I started trying to do the craft. But then there were, for example, the whole thing about the ghost. When I in Beloved, when I first really grasped history, because I've been in the archives since 1990, I realized that the ghost was, the rememory, the historical rememory. And that at the end of Beloved, when those 30 women come to the house to exorcise, the ghost Beloved, they are exorcising oppression of slavery. And in her body, her presence, that is what they're doing. But it took me, 3 or 4 readings to really get that. And then I felt really accomplished. I was like, oh, okay, I'm super smart now, but yeah. So I think, I think just, introducing young folks to books that they aren't always going to get on the first try, but then they'll learn, they'll grow into it. And there's an empowerment in that, particularly for Black students. I think the biggest thing that I always think about is, when you're talking about how Black people, laws going back to the 18th century, anti-literacy laws, right? there's something very spiritual about reading, and not simply intellectual.
Mhm.
I feel connected to my ancestors when I read. I think about that. Even now, I'm trying to get my French back. I'm not really sure how much I had to begin with, but I'm in French tutorial, and it was very difficult and not even humbling. And I'm coming to a point here. It was humiliating, you know, that because I started reading when I was 4.5 or 5, right? And I was always really arrogant, about I was a great reader and blah 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 blah. And I realized how very classist, a classist little girl I was, and a grown woman. These are the things that sort of shake you, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then I was, I I got into French tutorial, and I had to start with children's books in French. And it was I felt ashamed. And then I said, "Why do I feel ashamed?" And then I realized that I had mapped that unknowingly onto my mother's people, right? The old people. And then one night, I woke up in the middle of the night and I said, I'm a very faithful person. God had me to study French so that I could understand what my ancestors went through, learning how to read and write from their ABCs. And it was it came upon me, right? And so I mean, I got choked up when I was looking at the beginning, um, um, the introduction about folks, because I said, yes, this is what it's all about. This is empowering to us. It's not simply, yes, it's everyday learning certain things, but it's also a connection when you're getting, people of African descent, so that we understand our history through learning the written word. And so when we go back to Morrison and we think about this folklore, right, which is oral literacy, right? These stories passed. So she is connecting to the ancestors through these stories, through this oral literature. And then she is showing that she has mastered Western literature and that the two are joined. It's just phenomenal. It's just phenomenal.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if we'll have time for both of the questions that I have left.
Are we going to have a Q&A, Miss Mary?
That's an excellent question.
I hope I'm not overstepping here.
No, not at all. I wish I was better informed. I don't think so. I think
Okay.
we just have some closing remarks.
Okay.
But well, okay, I'm going to try and squeeze both of these questions in. The first one has two parts, and that is, what attracted you to Morrison's work, and why do you think others might be attracted to it? And then we have another quite important question after that one. So maybe just a brief
I just
answer.
love
on
her
these.
being just a hardcore intellectual, stone cold Black woman who knows who can make words sing. That's just my simple, just and that she and other Black women provided this path for me to be able to be a stone cold Black woman who can make words sing. Like I'm just, I've never met her, and I don't compare myself to her at, this lady was a genius. We will never see her like again. But the fact that she made this way for so many Black women writers, she and other Black women, so many. It to me, when I'm reading her now in my 50s, was different reading her in my 30s and 40s. When I read her now in my 50s, I understand something about, just a little bit, about the challenges that she faced as a Black woman artist. And I am humbled. And as a Leo, it's hard to be humbled. But I am humbled. I am humbled, as a literate person in a way that I wasn't before. I am humbled that I can read and write. My French lessons have taught me that. I am humbled that I can put words to paper, and I am humbled that I am laboring in this rich tradition that Morrison established, that other people established for her. So when I'm reading her, I just feel filled and and just so honored and grateful.
Well, the first novel that I read was Sula, and I came to Sula at a very important time in my life, sort of a post-traumatic stress moment after I had been involved in a court order for desegregation in 1970. And I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and the ways in which, finally enacting the Supreme Court decision of 1954 in 1970. And the way they did that, of course, was to close all the Black high schools, and all the Black students didn't have to go to what had been the white high schools. And the community was just atomized. All the high school in the Black community was the social and cultural center of the community. Mm-hmm. And so when they closed those schools, I mean, they're just people I never saw again. It was just traumatic. And so I was in a space of missing and thinking reflectively about my community. And when I read Sula, it was that community in the bottom that just spoke to me, where the chefs can't remember the recipes unless they had their hats on, or the men at the pool hall with the pointed toes down to the floor. It was just the language, just everything. And it continued that way in Song of Solomon and Tar Baby and Beloved. Toni Morrison, I have been attracted to Toni Morrison through all of these years because she showed me how to love my people in a very deliberate and articulate and historical and cultural way. Don't get me wrong. I grew up in a small segregated community. You loved your community. There was no question about that. Mama and daddy and my grandparents and the people in the church and the school. Yes, I love them. But this was helping me to see the community in broad cultural strokes. And that guided my teaching, that guided my research. And so I will be forever grateful to Morrison for that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your concision, both of you. So this is the final question. What words of advice do you have for newer educators joining us tonight in the audience on teaching Toni Morrison for the first time? Words of advice for newer teachers.
Keep the faith. keep the faith, because it is going to get worse. Mm-hmm. I don't mean to harsh the mellow, but I do think that, as somebody, as we say it in my generation, I'm from the dirty South. I'm from the deep South. It's going to get worse in terms of people trying to attack literacy. Mm-hmm. And so we need to keep that faith. Dr. Denard is the scholar, so I'm going to defer to her to talk about the intellectual processes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're right, Honorée. It is going to take courage and persistence. But if you are able to find yourself in a school district where, and I'm speaking primarily to high school teachers, I think this is where the the banning of books comes in, and where the difficulty arises because you're teaching 16 and 17-year-olds and sometimes 14 and 15-year-olds. And and even the teachers themselves who love Morrison, who want their students to read Morrison, most of them did not read Morrison when they were 14, 15, and 16. So they came to Morrison as adults. The people who taught them came to Morrison as adults. So this business of trying to teach these difficult novels to advanced students in advanced placement classes is a difficult thing. But there are some things that I would like to suggest. And the first thing is that you need to do the background work. And this is hard. And I have found that what helps me is, I don't know, the curriculums are set, or the curricula is set by the school sometimes. So you have to teach these many novels. But I think we sometimes try to get through too many books at one time. But if you're going to teach a Morrison novel, take the summer and do the background reading. Give yourself the opportunity, as Honorée said, to read the novel more than once. So I think you need to do the background work so that you can understand the culture, understand the history, understand the times, the words, the folklore, all of those things that are embedded in the work. And then I think you need to break up the work. You need to identify the parts that you think are going to be hard and confrontational or difficult for students, as well as the parts that are going to be wonderful and joyous. But it's when the parts are difficult and hard and confrontational that students have problems. The one or two scenes where there might be intimacy in the novel that the students don't understand, or language that about race that they don't understand. It's always interesting to me that people want to ban Song of Solomon because Ruth kisses her dead father's hands, but not because of the 7 days, which is far more challenging, far more of a threat than anything going on between Hagar and Guitar. So it's just really interesting to me that they aren't reading the whole novel. That's what's happening. But I say to the teachers, take the time, break the novel up. You need to teach your novels the way Perry Mason operates in the courtroom. You need to know the answers to the questions before you ask them. So this is one of the things that I suggest you do. And then I think what I alluded to earlier is that you need to decide what you want the novel to be a metaphor for. It can't do everything. It could. I mean, we don't all have to have the same metaphor that we want. But if you want to teach a novel where it's about family love, say that's what you want to emphasize in this text, or you want to emphasize mother-daughter relationships, so you want to emphasize friendship or loss, or whatever, you need to decide what is the takeaway for your students. That's something that you are going to have to really think about. What is the takeaway? And lead with that. Then I think as students in this contemporary period with the contested environment that many of you will be teaching, you need to be proactive. You need to go to the school board meetings, talk to your students, invite your students to help you with the pedagogy, to say, this is a difficult part. How do you think we ought to handle this in the class? And read a passage for them without, there being a quiz or a paper in the balance, just to engage them in the pedagogy. And then finally, I think you should seek out the help or try to of those who have developed cultural pedagogies. I think Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress is one of those books that you might look at. Certainly Paulo Freire, who Pedagogy of the Oppressed has been instrumental in many of the later pedagogies that have come along. There's a book by Geneva Gay, Culturally Responsive Teaching, and then Dorothy Washington has just completed a book called Culturally Responsive Reading. It's hard work. It is what Honorée says. The books are chocked full of so much information. And we don't need to get sidetracked with one scene that is questionable in terms of the explicit nature of the language or the explicit nature of the sex. And there's just not a lot of that in Morrison. I mean, she's masterful in describing sexual scenes without any of the language that you ordinarily think of in terms of doing that. And I think that one of the things that I would like to invite teachers to think about, you can do this in teacher groups or teacher workshops, or is to engage in something that I think they call in psychology restorative pedagogy. These are difficult times. Most often you're teaching in mixed classes. When I first taught Beloved, I was teaching to mostly white students, and they just kind of shut up for their beating. They didn't say, at that time, they just didn't say a word. I was a Black woman. I was teaching a Black woman about this horrible thing that happened. I know nothing. I will say nothing. And so you have to then restore the learning moment for your students. So I am interested in something called restorative pedagogy. When you don't want your students, not your white students or your Black students. When I taught Beloved to Black students, I mean, they were up in arms, that how dare, it was what their responses would have been to school teacher. So they were really sort of zeroing in on how they would have responded to Setha being pinned down in the barn and having her milk taken. These things enraged them, and they wanted to find ways to fight back. So as a teacher, you have to say, well, how do we not leave this classroom with students still angry about a scene that they read in the novel? Because the novel is a 300-page metaphor, and you can't you can't just take away one little piece of it and think that you have your students take away one piece and think they understand. So I think you have to be proactive in trying to develop a pedagogy that brings about restoration for your white students. They move to a better place after reading these very difficult texts about very difficult subjects. So those are some of the things that I would suggest: is doing the background work, breaking the work up, deciding what you want to be the metaphorical takeaway for this novel. Be proactive with your students and your community and your other faculty, and then find resources to help you develop a restorative pedagogy.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. This has been beyond enlightening. This is absolutely, I don't have words to tell you how valuable this has been.
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you. I've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed it too.
I did my best, but Dr. Denard really brought the brilliance, the experience.
Books Critics Circle Award. You are a genius in your area, and I congratulate you on your 6th book and your novel.
You're so kind. But I didn't say that.
I'm so
intrigued, compliment.
So intrigued by the title. You were courageous. The love songs of W.B. Du Bois. Oh my goodness! I think.
Well, I always know when I'm in the presence of greatness. And I have absolutely no ego when it comes to being in the presence of greatness. My mother and my father were educators. And so you just are doing such wonderful work. And I'm going to revisit this video to get all the wisdom.
Yeah. Well, I'd encourage you. You are a life member of the Toni Morrison Society.
Yes, ma'am.
Encourage others who are interested certainly in this, in the teaching workshops that we plan to have. We're going to be celebrating our 30th anniversary this fall. And so we would certainly look forward to presenting the programs around that. But please join the Toni Morrison Society if you want to be engaged more in these kinds of events. And once again, I want to thank Literacy Partners for
Yes.
this wonderful forum. Thank you, Honorée. This was the highlight for me to know that I was going to be sharing this platform with you. I'm so impressed with the novel, and thank you so much for writing it. And congratulations on your awards.
Well, I think all 400 of the viewers this evening have been in the presence of greatness. So we're very grateful to both of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I am sure that the 400 viewers would love to continue hearing what we've just heard over the last hour and a half. What a wonderful, insightful, powerful conversation. Thank you to the esteemed panelists and scholars, Dr. Carolyn Denard, also to Honorée Fannone Jeffers, excuse me. You have given us so much to consider and practical action steps for pedagogy, as well as the impact of Toni Morrison's work in our own lives. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And congratulations on 30 years. Thank you, Mary, for your skillful moderation. And to the viewers, thank you for joining us this evening for the celebration of Toni Morrison's event. I want to let you know that we have some more events this month in February. On the 22nd at 7 p.m., we have a panel on the legacy of Toni Morrison. On February 23rd and the 24th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have the readings of Song of Solomon. And on the 25th of February at 3 p.m., we also have the reading of Song of Solomon. We want to thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. And with that, we sign off.